Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Men's Mental Health, Understanding and Helping Male Depression. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few things so you know how to participate in today's event. So I've just uploaded a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. So you should see something like this on your own computer in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker, and you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. But there will be an opportunity to ask any questions, and I'll definitely try and get to these at the end and potentially as we go along as well. There's some handouts available just so you can access extra information that's kind of relevant to the webinar. You can download them during the webinar, but if you don't have a chance, there will be an opportunity on First Psychology's website after the webinar under News and Events tab. So there'll be an information on all our webinars, so don't panic if you don't get to have a hold of them for today. So just to give you an introduction, my name is Laura Sinnott. I'm a trainee counselling psychologist and I work as an applied psychology practitioner with First Psychology. To give you a little bit of an overview of what we'll do today. So we'll start with gaining an understanding of what depression is, how it is experienced by men, and this will be followed in ways which we can tackle the symptoms of depression from a perspective of self and others as well. Lastly, there will also be an opportunity to ask any questions at the end of the presentation, and I'd love to hear your feedback on what you enjoyed or thought you could be improved at the webinar as well. And just before we start, I'd just like to kind of gain an idea of what the audience would like to have from today's webinar. What's your main interest for today and what are you hoping to get out from it? Yes, I can see some of you are saying that you're keen to find out strategies to tackle understanding symptoms. Some of you are kind of, understanding what to look out for and seeing if there's any strategies to help friends if you know that they're struggling as well. Yeah, better understand how to reach out and assist friends and some information. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing kind of all your interests for today as well. And hopefully today will give you a really good in-depth view of what to look out for, why it's different, and hopefully give you some tools that you can kind of leave today feeling a little bit more prepared. Fantastic. So why is this topic so important? So just to give you an idea, globally, depression is considered more prevalent among women than men. However, rates of suicide remain 4 times more likely for men to complete suicide than women. However, women are diagnosed with depression twice as more than men, so there's a bit of a disparity there. So the risk of suicide for men is what leads some to suggest that there is a silent epidemic. This epidemic is due to a combination of men hiding psychological problems and also a reluctancy to report symptoms, as well as due to the diagnostic tools that professionals use potentially being less attuned to being able to diagnose men with depression as well, which we'll start to understand a little bit further as we go along in today's webinar. And just to provide you all with a really local statistic, the Mental Health Foundation suggested that in 2018, 31% of Scottish men have experienced suicidal thoughts as a result of stress causing low mood. So I feel like that statistic is a real indicator of how prevalent low mood and depression can be for men, yet for some reason the statistics aren't matching up that diagnosis. So understanding depression. Some of you may know that Winston Churchill struggled with depression and described it as being his black dog. So depression is sometimes described metaphorically by various things. Black dog is quite a popular one. It's important to note, however, that not all sadness is depression, and we should avoid medicalizing normal human experience. So we want to look out for depression and recognize that when low mood is persistent and accompanied with associated symptoms, which we'll explore shortly. And when thinking about the causes of depression, it's believed that to emerge from an interaction of varying factors. So these can include a person's vulnerability for the development of depression, where there may be a presence of childhood adversity, trauma, personality, and stressful life events. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what stressful life events look like, they're typically categorized in 4 categories, where there may be a requirement of adaptation, a presence of threat or harm, demands which exceed resources, or an interruption of goals. So when a stressful life event has taken place, due to a great sense of adaptation or change, this can include experiences such as financial stress, aging, as well as positive events such as marriage or becoming a new father. So here, both women and men are also known to suffer from postnatal depression. When a stressful life event has taken place because of a presence of threat or harm, so examples of these situations might be where someone's diagnosed with a serious illness or surviving a serious accident. If someone's facing demands which exceed their resources, this typically presents when someone is experiencing a lot of stress within a professional context. So they might be spreading themselves out too thin and feel like they're unable to meet their employer's demands. But it can also be found in situations where someone is struggling to financially support their household due to cost of living or loss of employment. And to give you a little bit of example of what interruption of goals might look like, this can be found when someone has gained a physical ailment or limitation which prevents them from reaching certain goals, or an event that's taken place which has threatened an individual's sense of identity. So this might be divorce, bereavement, loss of job, retirement. And as some of you may have noticed, these categories aren't clear cut. There might be a stressful life event which can fit into varying categories, but I thought it might be helpful to outline for today just to kind of give you a sense of what you can look out for and understand what might be really taking a toll on someone's life or your own even as well. So, opinions. Before we discuss the symptoms of depression, out of curiosity, I'd like to know what symptoms you're all anticipating to come across, if you're willing to share. Yeah, so some of you are saying withdrawing, not going out as much, withdrawal, loss of energy and motivation, difficulty sleeping, quietness, denial, exhaustion, loss and gain weight, bad healthy habits with addiction, absolutely, lack of drive, and not looking after appearance. So all of you have really pointed out really relevant symptoms, and some things really observable, others may be experienced by the person themselves. So if they're really struggling to get out of bed, really noticing that lack of energy. So really fantastic responses, and thank you so much for everyone sharing. Many of you responded with what could be considered as being typical symptoms or more feminine symptoms of depression as described in the literature. So it's important to note that this does not mean that typical or feminine symptoms aren't experienced by men. It's merely terminology that's used in the literature, which actually gives us a little bit of insight as to why maybe diagnostic criteria are less attuned to diagnosing men with depression. So specifically, typical symptoms are experiencing sadness, guilt, worthlessness, crying, lack of enjoyment in activities, which I think some of you mentioned. So these are the typical symptoms which diagnostic criteria look out for. However, men who endorse a masculine gender role are more likely to present atypical symptoms, and externalize these through substance abuse, angry outbursts, or may have strained relationships as well. Just to go over some, which actually some of you have mentioned in what you're anticipating to see: denial of pain, sadness, over-involvement at work, impulsive moods, change in sex drive, so that can be an increase or decrease, change in appetite or weight, which can also be increase or decrease, harsh self-criticism, self-medicating behaviour, and social withdrawal. Some others which you mentioned as well: change in concentration, change in sleep, and quality of sleep. And if any attendees feel comfortable sharing their experience, as responses are completely anonymous, I wonder if any of you have experienced these symptoms when struggling with your mental health or feeling low. Perhaps you've experienced symptoms which I've not mentioned in our slides. Yeah, feeling really tearful. Urge to run, get away. Yeah. Lack of concentration. Yeah, a lot of you are also mentioning that you experience the symptoms that I've listed above as well. Short fuse, so lack of patience potentially, not being in control. No, absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing, everyone. That's really helpful. And before we move on to explore, oh, sorry, on the wrong slide. Before we move on to explore why men predominantly experience depression differently to women, I'd like to ask the audience what your opinion is of these two individuals who are fictional, just to let you know. So both Danny and Rory have experienced the exact same incident and are struggling with depression following being in a car accident whilst driving for work. So since the incident, Danny has cried many times at the memory of the accident. He reaches out to friends and family about how he struggles with driving and no longer feels independent. He feels guilty and worthless about being unable to do simple tasks at home, such as completing food shop with the car, and he's told work about the issue who have facilitated him seeking help from a professional. Rory, on the other hand, has told everyone that he's doing just fine. He's remained very stoic about the incident, and whenever asked how he's coping, he avoids the conversation, says how he wants to continue focusing on work, has actually asked for an increase in responsibility at work and refused any support offered by his workplace. So now that we've heard a little bit of a difference between Danny and Rory and how they've handled the situation differently, I'd just like to ask you all what your assumptions are of these two men. How do you view them? Is there one person that you respect more? Is there one person that you potentially identify with more? Yeah, so someone's mentioned how both have different coping mechanisms. So others feel like Rory is coping better than Danny. Yeah. So someone said that they would be worrying more about Rory. Yeah. And how Rory's distracting himself more and using different coping strategies. So a little bit of a mixture, how some of you are saying that Rory's coping better and others saying that you'd be a little bit more worried about Rory. Someone also mentioned how Rory might be in denial, showing self-defeating behaviours, being avoidant. Absolutely, really fantastic responses. So actually some of the attributes or characteristics that you all pointed out could potentially fit within our culturally dominant or hegemonic forms of masculinity. So I wanted to point this out because it might help us understand why men experience depression differently to women. Specifically, it's important to consider that men who do not enact within our dominant constructions of masculinity risk being singled out and experiencing marginalization. So in the previous example, where Rory is in denial, he's not opening up, he's not showing that he's vulnerable, that might be because he's been socialized to, you know, not cry, he has to be stoic, otherwise he's seen as weak. So men who are socialized to act and think in a way which adheres to traditional gender roles and expectations do struggle with mental health, but it's how they feel like they can express it. So some of you might be familiar with the sayings on the slide, men don't cry, or other things that you might hear growing up. So being socialized to these social norms do influence how men feel like they can react to certain situations. However, when men experience an excessive sense of pressure to conform to these traditional roles of masculinity, it does show to increase the risk of men engaging with suicidal behavior, particularly as traditional masculine norms discourage men from showing weakness or emotional pain. It leads to restraining in help-seeking behavior, which further makes them vulnerable towards mental health problems or suicide. So men can feel stigmatized when struggling with depression. An additional factor which can present itself with depression is when a man is struggling with sexual or erectile dysfunction as a result of low mood and stress. So the inability to perform sexually can reinforce that feeling of being weak, which again conflicts with that idea of traditional masculine norms and creates further barriers to help seeking. It's important to mention that things are changing. Managing the pandemic showed the availability of telephone or online support lines, which played a positive role in mental health seeking habits. With the help of mental health campaigns, there has been a shift in masculine norms now. So actually men are almost 3 times more likely to seek therapy when worried or feeling low compared to when attitudes were measured in 2009. So I think that's a great sense of how things are changing, and some of the masculine norms that we might cover today might not be norms that you identify with or have been socialized with, and that's absolutely fine as well. And things are changing compared to potentially the world that our grandparents lived in, for example. So now that we've spoken a little bit about men being socialized within certain norms, I'd like to discuss some common coping strategies which are adopted by men. In regards to depression, men are socialized to avoid expressing emotion and cope with the experience through externalizing behaviors. I'd like to have a quick question time. So if I told you you were standing in the middle of a road and a huge truck was speeding towards you, how do you think you would feel in that moment? Petrified, scared, absolutely terrified, flight freeze, absolutely. Some of you are saying that you would jump out of the road, you would need to move. Okay, absolutely. So for those of you, and I'm glad some of you did respond that way, I was hoping for it. So some of you that responded saying that you would jump out the way. This is a great example of how men are socialized to avoid introspection of how they might be feeling, because I'd actually originally asked you how you would feel, not what you would do. So coping strategies which promote traditional masculine traits can include concealing or ignoring negative emotions and engaging in risk behaviors. So these risky behaviors can include self-destructiveness like drug use, binge drinking, gambling, workaholism. Furthermore, as men are traditionally taught to dissociate themselves from emotions, these vulnerable emotions can be expressed through chronic anger, road rage, lack of patience. These avoidant coping strategies with an increased use of alcohol or drugs are also associated with self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and suicide attempts. And just to clarify, so for some of you who may be eagle-eyed and notice that some of the symptoms of depression are the same as coping strategies, that's because symptoms are subjective complaints of an individual's experiencing, which they can disclose or another person can observe. So when we understand the pattern of symptoms, this can help us understand the cause. So for example, if someone's experiencing sadness, is socially withdrawn, has a change to their sex drive, and is increasing their alcohol consumption, this pattern does include coping strategies, which is alcohol use and social withdrawal. along with sadness, the emotional aspect of it, but the pattern of those symptoms can help us determine that they are struggling with depression. So it's just to kind of explain why some of the things might be crossing over across symptoms and coping strategies. So how can you support yourself? Now that we've explored how depression presents itself amongst men, why it might emerge, and why it is experienced differently, I'd like to start exploring strategies that will help you support yourself if you find you're struggling with depression. But before we do this, I'd like to ask the audience what barriers you think might be in the way of adopting healthy coping strategies, unlike the unhealthy coping strategies that we've just discussed there. So some of you are saying stigma as a barrier, pride. Peer pressure, demands of others, including home and work. Some friends potentially not being as supportive, saying to get over it, not knowing how to talk about it. Yeah, work pressures, people not necessarily understanding what it feels like. And some of you are saying not knowing what's available or how to start. And hopefully from today's webinar, I can kind of give you a sense of some of the things that you can do so that you feel that you've got a few more tools and potentially routes of support to know where to begin with it all. So absolutely, so some barriers that you all mentioned are really relevant ones. Other barriers might be related to image. So some of you mentioned that peer pressure, how the action is perceived by peers. So for example, if a man's just struggling with depression and increasing their consumption of alcohol to cope with their vulnerable emotions, it can be really difficult to stop going to the pub or keeping up with the lads because of peer pressure or the drinking culture that they might be in. Some barriers might be the perceived cost of engaging with these healthy coping strategies as well. So some people do think about the cost of healthy food, the cost of memberships for specific activities like the gym or some other things that and obviously with the cost of living going up, absolutely it's very fair that that's the thing that people consider when thinking about ways to support themselves and how it might be a potential barrier. So ways in which you can support yourself. So as we discussed how masculine and gender norms can influence help-seeking attitudes and coping strategies, this is a great first point to consider when adopting strategies which will allow you to support yourself. Specifically, I'd like to ask yourself which traditional masculine norms or mantras that you adopt in order to ensure your identity as a man is retained. So below I've listed a few which may have a detrimental impact or act as a barrier towards help seeking and managing depression. How rigid are the mantras that you adhere to? Is there any possibility for flexibility? So below I've just got men deal with emotions by having a drink in the pub, men shouldn't show emotion or they're weak, and men should be in control. So all these mantras are actually really rigid. It doesn't leave much flexibility if you are struggling. So these traditional masculine norms can be reframed in a way which makes them more helpful. Specifically, it takes a lot of independence to act outside the norm and not follow what other men's way of coping. It takes courage to express your feelings and willingness to accept a challenge in order to work through these. So all really masculine qualities. And if it takes assertiveness and leadership to know that you need a break as well. So it's kind of how can we fit those mantras in a way that fits within your identity of being a man, but is actually quite helpful to you in your mental well-being. Just to provide you a little tip, if you're struggling to find a way to reframe your own mantras, consider what you might tell a friend if they had the same masculine norms and were struggling with depression. We're often much more compassionate to others than ourselves, so changing perspectives can be an easy way to start reinterpreting your own thoughts and beliefs in a way that's helpful to you. And actually, I was thinking before today's webinar of some really rigid mantras. I actually know that my grandfather, he doesn't believe in therapy, and that's maybe a mantra of his where he thinks, you know, talking about emotions is not useful as a coping strategy for a man, and actually that's really rigid. So and that's the way my granddad was socialized growing up as a child. So hopefully things are changing, but it's helpful to consider what do you listen to, what do you tell yourself, and is it actually helping you? So I'd like to also just mention that masculine norms do vary depending on age, upbringing, culture, as do men's alignment to those ideals. So some of you might not necessarily adhere to my grandpa's mantras, and vice versa. You know, someone that's younger, someone that's older, depending on generation, your culture, your upbringing. So this variation in men adopts results in a range of beliefs being adopted as well. So when recovering from depression, it's really important for men to reconstruct a valued sense of themselves and their own masculinity in a way that's constructive to them. So if it's important for your own masculine identity to have a sense of control, rather than engaging with overworking as a coping strategy, utilize that identity in a way that's helpful to you. So gain control over problem solving, or gain control over your body through exercise, breath work, or mindfulness. So it's just little tweaks that we can make. You know, you're not changing your identity as a man, but how can we use that as a strength to help us? So how can we use control as a strength to help us for our well-being? So in a study exploring how men manage their experience with depression, taking time out was the most commonly used management strategy. So taking time out can mean varying things, including choosing an activity that can regulate your emotion or your physical sensations, such as exercise or mindfulness-based activities. These don't need to involve expensive memberships and can be enjoyed and achieved through simple exercise at home or outside. Similarly with mindfulness or relaxation-based activities, which I believe there is a handout provided just to give you a bit more in-depth view and information that you can go through in your own time. So prioritizing taking time out also involves the process of behavioral activation. Specifically, this is about making your life meaningful and enjoyable again. Depression presents itself as a vicious cycle because once we start feeling low, we notice a lack of energy, we might start doing the things that keep us safe, and then the cycle begins again. Usually when this cycle takes place, we wait for our motivation to kick in to do things that we need to. Unfortunately, when we're experiencing depression, the motivation isn't automatic. So it means that you need to get active before you feel that motivation starting, even if you don't feel up to it initially. So by doing this, your energy will increase and it will promote your well-being. Behavioral activation can be achieved by incorporating activities which you associate with your highest mood, provide you with a sense of connection or achievement. So tracking your activities and planning out your time by setting goals for the future can also be really helpful and beneficial. So if you've got a calendar, a diary, setting out potentially 3 days out of the 7 where you have a morning or an evening to do a walk or something that gives you a connection or achievement can be really helpful in sticking with that routine, because again, that motivation won't be helping you. The lack of motivation, I mean, won't be helping you along the way. In addition to incorporating behavioral activation and relaxation, other things that can help manage your symptoms of depression are managing alcohol consumption and unhelpful habits. Some unhelpful habits might include self-criticism or unhelpful thinking strategies. Reframing your negative thoughts can be a challenging task. However, reviewing how much factual evidence your thoughts can have may be beneficial and influence your emotional response. And again, there is a resource booklet provided which explains this in depth and can let you go through all these negative thinking styles in your own time and help tackle that. Another way in which you can support yourself, and perhaps the most important strategy, is to seek support, particularly if you're struggling. Reach out to friends or professionals. Doing this can tackle feelings of loneliness, which are common amongst men struggling with depression. Seeking support from a GP can also provide a space where you discuss your emotional experience, both of the pros and cons of medication, and seeking support from a therapist can help you explore your experiences in depth and help tackle, again, those negative cognitions that are keeping you stuck in a cycle within your depression. So how can you support others? some barriers of talking to mental health, which is a way that you can support others. I just wanted to cover these, which actually some of them were mentioned in barriers to supporting yourself. There is, fear of discrimination, stigma. I think from a perspective of trying to support others, there is a worry about respecting someone's privacy, not being too intrusive, wanting to respect if they want to keep things to themselves. Some other barriers for supporting other people who might be struggling with depression might be unsure how to approach the topic, and also misunderstanding signs of distress, which maybe we've tackled a little bit at the start of today's webinar. So the CAM Zone have brought out a campaign where they suggest to think about Alan, ask, listen, encourage action, and help build a support network. So this is a great and simple way where we can break down the stigma and start normalizing conversations of mental health, especially if someone is struggling. Asking and talking about mental health can tackle secret keeping that men engage with as fear of being seen as weak. And just listening and avoiding providing any solutions can really aid that sense of independence, which is important to traditional masculine norms. And lastly, aiding someone in building a support network can tackle avoidance and help seeking, which is also found within men who are experiencing depression. So I'd like to ask all your opinions. I'd just like to check the audience's feelings about around asking a loved one whether they might be experiencing suicidal thoughts if you know that they're struggling with their mood. I wonder if this is something that you feel like you could do, if so, why, or if you'd feel like this wouldn't be a comfortable topic of conversation, why not as well? So some of you are saying that you'd be upset about worrying them or upsetting them. Some are saying that in a very gentle way that you would broach the topic of conversation. Yeah, others are saying that if it was for a loved one, it would be important to you to make sure that their safety was prioritized. Others are saying it wouldn't be a comfortable conversation, but you would do it. And others are mentioning as well, not sure how to go about it if someone did say that they were having suicidal thoughts, not sure how to help or what to do with that information, not wanting to make it worse. No, absolutely. All really valid points, and thank you so much for sharing your opinions on that as well. So if having answered that this is something that feels like it isn't the right approach, or it's a common worry that people have around this conversation. So specifically, some people worry that it indirectly encourages or plants a seed for a person struggling with depression to later act on their feelings. But just to give you a bit of reassurance, research does show that openly talking about suicide actually decreases the likelihood of someone acting on these feelings. So a resource giving some information about how to talk about suicide will be shared at the end of the presentation. It's just a little website link that is super helpful and hopefully provides us a little bit more confidence in how to use that information, how to tackle it, how to approach the subject. And importantly, if you believe you are feeling suicidal and you would like to talk to someone about this, you can contact your GP or helplines who can provide you support through, between all of them, support through all hours of the day. And I just uploaded on this slide some of the numbers as well, which you can access at a later date. So fostering social connection, another way in which you can support someone else if you believe that they might be struggling with depression, particularly if they've exhibited a change in energy and enjoyment and activities, is to suggest other meaningful activities that you can do together. So studies have shown that prioritizing pleasurable routines and social connection can act as a significant prevention strategy or management strategy. So some of you might be familiar with the concept of men's sheds. It's typically a community-based program where men can come together, develop friendships, gain a sense of accomplishment, and feel part of something. Although engagement with a men's shed is a really specific example, fostering connection and a sense of achievement can be gained through any meaningful activity. Here, an individual can reconstruct a valued sense of themselves and their own masculinity. And actually, it's really similar to the concept of behavioural activation, which we covered in the slides of how to support yourself. So you could consider this strategy to foster connection as being part of that behavioural activation, being that individual in a loved one's life where you are encouraging them, motivating them to do an activity together, can actually reinforce their well-being as well as yours. Yeah. So we've got to the question and answer round. So hopefully you guys are all kind of gaining an understanding of what to look out for and some tools and strategies. But we've got a few minutes left to answer any questions that might be looming after today's webinar. So some of you are asking, how do you foster social connection when you hate human company? So I guess what's coming up for me is that question is potentially if you were more introverted, if that's the way that to recharge your batteries by, having that alone time, how do you foster social connection if it's something that you don't enjoy? And I think social connection can mean varying things for everyone. It doesn't necessarily have to be, a huge group-based thing where you're in a huge room with other people. It could even mean just having that community where you can share your interests, whether it be online, whether it be in person. And again, I think everyone benefits from different things. So I think fostering social connection is important with depression because typically it does leave us isolating ourselves from others, and that can feed into loneliness, which again continues that idea of that cycle within depression. So doesn't necessarily mean that has to be a group activity, but just maybe finding something that suits your needs where you don't feel all alone and you can share your interests, if that answers your question, hopefully. If I slip into a dark, depressive mood, is the best remedy to actually do things to help me pick out of this situation? Absolutely. So it's almost counterintuitive when you are feeling really low, in the sense that your body is physically telling you, I don't want to get out of bed, I'm not sleeping well, you have that lack of energy. But actually, the cycle of depression continues because then we're not feeling productive with our time, or we don't do the things that we need to do to keep us safe, which further feeds into that idea of worthlessness. We lose our sense of identity through that as well. We almost feel like we've become a shell of a person. So it feels in the moment really counterintuitive, but one of the really beneficial things that you can do, and research shows this, is to tackle that feeling. Even if you don't feel like it, go do the things that used to give you enjoyment. It's going to be a long journey, but along the way, that motivation and enjoyment will start to creep in again. It's just trying to stick to your guns with that strategy for sure. So someone's asking, how do you start to help someone close who doesn't believe that you can help them? Refer to a GP at that stage. Absolutely. I think it is very difficult if the beliefs there are really set, well, they feel like they're set in stone and they don't feel like there's any way out of it. And I guess just explore being a shoulder to listen to, for the person to feel heard and listened to, is really important. And I think engaging with them, again, that whole shifting perspective idea can be really useful. Ask them what they would tell you or their friend if they were in the same situation. What would they ask them to do? A lot of the time someone was struggling with depression would say, yes, I would tell my friend to go to the GP. I would tell my friend to seek support. But when it comes to ourselves, we're not that compassionate. So just being someone that you can really provide that space to feel listened and heard is an important step, and just offer support in terms of who can we contact that you feel comfortable with. It might be GP, it might be family member. How do you break the barrier of someone suffering and doesn't want to talk or open up? Really challenging question, and again, that's the whole challenge with men who struggle with depression, because that feels like they can't open up. It feels like it tackles their identity as being a man. So I think starting with acknowledging that, acknowledge how their identity as a man might be playing as a barrier, encouraging them and saying, you are no lesser of a man if you do struggle with your emotions. Or also, actually, if you identify as a man yourself, a lot of the time that I've even seen in my own personal experience and practice is when men open up to their male friends or other men around them about how they've engaged with support or engaged with therapy, it has a huge beneficial impact. It really opens up someone's mind to, okay, actually, maybe is that something that I can do? My friend did it and they benefited from it. So I think encouraging them that it doesn't make them any less of a man, tackle that traditional masculine norms. And also, if you yourself have struggled, be vulnerable back with them. It can really try and break down those barriers and show them that they're not alone in this experience and that there is a way out of it. Just reading through some of the questions. So someone else is mentioning engaging with activities, nothing to do with addressing the concern or spending time together. I think it goes both ways. It goes with what you're comfortable with. I think if you've noticed that someone is hiding in their shell a little bit more, they're not doing the things or not hanging out with friends as much as they used to, encouraging a little bit of activity, and hopefully by that they can feel really safe with you and potentially might open up about struggling. If that addresses the question, hopefully. So someone else is actually mentioning how social anxiety is a major factor in stopping people coming to our men's group. Absolutely. So with depression as well, there can be comorbidity. So that means basically not only struggling with depression, but struggling with something else. So that might be anxiety. It might be other factors as well. And absolutely, I think actually that social anxiety, I think that's what COVID with all the online and telephone support showed, that when we can offer almost a little stepping stone where they don't necessarily have to push their comfort boundaries out too far by sitting in a room with other men and talking about the experience and being able to kind of be in the safety of their own room or house and access that therapeutic support is a really beneficial first step, because I think a lot of the time once that's been a positive experience, it then leads them to actually feeling more prepared and able to potentially access group support too, which can be really helpful to tackle that loneliness that men do experience when struggling with depression. So I'm just mindful of the time, so I just wanted to go over the slides of additional resources as well just before we leave today. So below I've just attached some websites that I think are personally very beneficial and helpful. So How to Help a Friend, the Calm Zone, kind of what to look out for. Again, it covers a bit of the info that we did in today's slide. I particularly like the Practice Having a Conversation website, which has been out from November, which is coming up next month. It's a really nice interactive text message conversation that you can do, and you can select the response that you think you would do, and Movember then provide a little bit of insight as to how that response might be perceived, what would be a helpful way to go about it. The Man Up website has a bunch of videos of interviews with men from varying professional contexts, talking about how they struggled with depression, which I think is really nice, breaks down the stigma. And lastly, there's also that website there for supporting someone with suicidal thoughts. and some of the handouts that you'll either be able to download now or after today's webinar on the First Psychology website to give you a bit more in-depth view. And again, if there's any looming questions that I've not had a chance to answer, that's my email address below. Feel free to pop me an email and I'll try and get back to you all as quickly as possible and clarify anything that was potentially unclear. So thank you very much everyone for attending today's webinar. And I hope you found it helpful.